to GONKCAST, a long-form discussion podcast about the music of English electronic duo Autechre, album by album, EP by EP. I'm Gabe.
I'm Dan.
And this is a continuation of the discussion we started last episode on Autechre's 2008 LP, Quaristice, this time covering most of the rest of the Quaristice era, aka the Quaristice cinematic universe, with the Quaristice versions bonus disc and the Quaristice.Quadrange.ep. I feel like that is not going to make sense to anybody but the most hardcore Autechre fans, that sentence. There will be a lot of sentences like that this episode. Before we jump in, don't forget that we've launched a Patreon where for just $5 a month, you'll get bi-weekly bonus episodes on AE adjacent music, plus the opportunity to vote on future bonus episode topics. Last week, the patrons decided that we should cover Flying Lotus's 2008 LP, Los Angeles. That was fun, wasn't it, Dan?
Yeah, it was. I think that was, we talked about that being one of the first records we really, me and you weren't all that familiar with, before doing the episode. So it was nice to look at something new.
Yeah, and it ended up being kind of a new favorite for you, right?
Yeah, I liked it a lot. Yeah. Don't spoil it. They got to pay $5.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's privileged information. Well, head on over to patreon.com/GONKCAST and join us for our next bonus episode. You're going to have to indulge us a little because I'm going to see a longtime bucket list band and one of Dan's favorite bands of all time as well, Sun, or, Sun O Prency if you're reading it. So we told the listeners to vote on the Sun album they'd most like to hear us discuss, and the winner was, drumroll, 2009's Monoliths and Dimensions. So look out for that. Send us your thoughts, goncastpod@gmail.com. For our next main episode, we've decided to treat ourselves to something lighthearted and clickbaity after the hard work of the Quaristice era. So we're going to count down our favorite Autechre closing tracks. Think that over and tell us about your favorite AE closers, goncastpod@gmail.com. You don't like to start these main episodes with some corrections, leftovers, news if there is any. This time there is some seriously important Autechre news, which is that Sean Booth has been confirmed to be a Ween fan. Over on Mastodon, someone replied to Sean's post mentioning LLMs with a joke about Ween's song LMLYP, or Let Me Lick Your Pussy, and he replied, quote, "The pod and Pure Guava are legendary, and this, too good," to which he was sharing a YouTube link to Ween's track Buckingham Green Studio Demo, of all things. I just thought this was so funny, Dan, because I think it was last episode or the episode before, your new music rec had been a new Ween live recording.
It was the episode right before he posted that. So,
wow.
Yeah, no.
So he listens for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically confirmed.
Basically confirmed, yeah. I just, I don't know. For some reason, I just get a kick out of the idea of like Sean listening to Ween. I don't know why that like
it is like a little funny, yeah.
Some other stuff that I kind of had been wanting to get to that was sort of leftovers from previous episodes. This one's from listener Jared, who said, "Hey Gonk, just recently discovered the podcast and I've been really enjoying it. The Glasgow Art School 2005 episode was great, and I was curious if either of you had heard their performance at Flux in Vienna in 1996. In my opinion, this is the best they have ever sounded, with Glasgow 2005 as a close second. It features two absolutely brutal, unknown improv jams and a rare instance of an AE album track being played fairly close to its studio version, obviously updated with an extended jam. That being said, it'd be great to get an episode on this performance. I'll provide some links. He shared me some YouTube stuff. Please consider. Thanks, guys." Actually, you might have noticed that where we kind of took our several year break on the podcast was like right in the middle of our, diving into the world of AE bootlegs. And I think we had planned to do Flux next when life just kind of got in the way. So I weirdly remember listening to it a lot, although we never recorded the episode, but we will for sure do an episode on this eventually because it is a legendary bootleg. And, thanks Jared for reminding us. You're on board, Dan, I'm assuming?
Yeah. I'd love to get into more of the bootlegs because honestly, with so much AE, official live, I don't know all that many of them all that well, except the ones that we've done on the podcast. So
it's true. Yeah. Another fun episode actually related to this episode today was the the Echoplex reconstruction of the Quaristice tour. That was really good. Yeah. So here's another kind of leftover from listener Lazy Peasy, aka Blue Drum, who says, thanks to you, I discovered the Shane Parrish Autechre guitar album, and I must say it's the first time I feel nostalgic listening to Autechre's music. It's also the first time my wife and son have listened to Autechre without staring at me with disapprobation, if I'm pronouncing that right. I can relate. I'm very happy to see the return of your podcast and really appreciate the Revisited series. I must say that Quaristice is one of my favorite albums, as I can feel knobs being turned listening to it. Really dig that jam feeling. Yeah, there are a couple points in this episode I think I'm going to mention, where you can actually hear the knobs being turned, which is fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
All right, we've got a hell of a lot of stuff to cover today, so should we dive into it, Dan?
Let's do it. All right, a little bit of background. Listeners will remember that Autechre's 2008 LP Quaristice was the result of meticulously editing down months of recorded jams in Sean's words, making a long version, then doing an editing, and editing that, then doing it again, seeing how far we could push them into being smaller things. Well, at some point, the guys decided to start sharing some of the alternate versions. As Sean put it in an interview from earlier this year, I was thinking about Art of Noise. I really liked them in the 80s when their tracks had so many overlapping versions. For example, with Moments in Love, there are probably around 90 minutes of different versions in total. There's so many that it's difficult to accurately determine which version you're listening to right now. Often the differences are only in the smallest details, but I really like that situation. It's a feeling of slight confusion for the listener, a sense of not knowing exactly where you are or which development you've entered. The song unfolds in a slightly different direction than what the listener expected. I think that kind of thing is interesting. I like the idea that things are repetitive and that there is no definitive version. There isn't one correct version, just many different variations. It's a bit like how multiple people who witness the same event give different testimonies. It's like everyone has their own version.
Interestingly, though, they first started doing this in an extremely limited way with a special edition Steelcase CD of Quaristice that included a bonus disc titled Quaristice Versions, limited to just 1,000 copies, which I think sold out instantly. When asked how he feels about the fact that almost everyone has had to resort to downloading this disc illegally, Sean said, obviously we knew that was going to happen, but only 1,000 people get the nice metalwork, and hopefully they'll look after them. At the same time, I'm willing to bet most fans had never even heard this until September of last year, 2005, when Quaristice Versions was finally made available on streaming and as a standalone digital release, as well as a first-time pressing on vinyl. The same is probably true of the Quadrange EP, which had a very different release method and was much more widely available, but was only put on streaming around that same time.
We'll get to Quadrange in a minute, but we might as well cover the background info now since we'll probably do a lot of jumping back and forth. Interestingly, the entire impetus for this release seems to have been in the final track, Perlet's Subrange 636, which is about an hour long. In a 2016 interview, Sean explained, when we did Quaristice, we had an hour-long track, and we thought, well, there's no point adding a whole extra CD to the proper album just for one track. Nobody's going to want to pay the extra money just for that, but if we put it online, a few people might buy it. We did that, and that worked, so that fed into what we're doing now. Instead of releasing it on its own, however, they packaged it with 12 more alternate versions from the Quaristice sessions, arranging them into 4 EPs, while nevertheless called the entire thing an EP of its own, and dropped 1 track per day on the Bleep store.
I wanted to add, because I think this is kind of amusing, that back in 2013, Rob said something about Quadrange that's very similar to what Sean would later say about Art of Noise, except he used Depeche Mode as his example. Regarding Quadrange, we'd been wanting to do something with variant mixes for a while, in some part due to having a wealth of EPs and extra B-sides from artists like Depeche Mode in the past. Some of their deepest tracks were unique alternative mixes, nothing like the singles or LP versions, and they came across as more intense or overproduced even. It was a really nice way to feel what they were doing behind the usual framework they set out in the mainstream, like a real treat. Okay, and lastly, I just want to mention the Digital Exclusives EP, which we're not talking about in depth today, but which was released in April 2008, right in between Quaristice Versions and the Quadrange EP, and which was another very limited release exclusive to the Japanese iTunes store, of all places. It contains 3 more Quaristice versions, though one is a repeat from the versions bonus disc. There was also a bonus track on the Japanese edition of the main Quaristice album titled New NR6D. So that altogether is the entire Quaristice era, but for the sake of our sanity, we're focusing today only on Quaristice versions and the Quadrange EP. So Dan, I want to propose something to you. We've got a lot of tracks to cover. I feel like you're going to kill me if I let this get, 4-hour podcast, like Joe Rogan level podcast or something, especially because you're a little under the weather for this episode of all things. But my thought first off is that we can probably move fairly quickly because we've already talked about these tracks like in kind of their basic form, and we're maybe thinking a little bit specifically just about like what's changed, what's different. But also I feel like we can move especially quickly through the versions disc, which to me is kind of like a curiosity. I mean, I think it truly feels like a bonus disc, whereas I think the Quadrange EP is like bordering on a masterpiece. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Versions like feels very much like this is something that we made 1,000 of for super fans, and Quadrange. While there's, I mean, obviously we'll get to it, but like there's pieces of Quaristice. It does feel like a different thing, like a actual separate, kind of thing, and I agree. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, Quadrange is like, I mean, the tracks are radically transformed. We'll talk about it, of course. Sometimes it is like the same track or a different edit or something from the original album, but it is in such a radically new context that it almost like feels like a totally different experience, which I think is like the real fun of this kind of approach to music, or releasing music rather. Whereas, the versions disc, I kind of hate, I got to be honest, that it tries to kind of follow the original track order of the album, but it only, does like some of the tracks. Of course, many of them, but not all of them, are like longer, so it ends up feeling like an expanded version of the album, but also an abridged version of the main album at the same time,
Yeah, it honestly feels like something that like didn't fully work, and I think like going through all that history we just did and everything, it sort of feels like they had this idea, and it's a good idea, and it kind of feels like 2008 was a little too early, maybe. Like this would have been a great thing to be able to put on streaming, which it's funny it took them
I know,
almost 20 years to get around to it, but like I think it just like, I don't know, versions like my problem is basically exactly what you said. Like it tries to recreate the original record, skips it. I think like as we go track by track, we'll get into this, but like the moods shift somewhat dramatically sometimes and stuff, and it just kind of really feels like a bonus disc, or like not like a curated collection like I think Quadrange does.
Yeah. I just think it's really strange that it like kind of tries to follow the structure of the original album, and yet of course makes then baffling decisions like a 12-minute version of Full 3, now called Full 4, which is like the one track nobody wanted an extended version of, that arguably already went on too long on the original album. So it's a weird thing, but I am so glad it exists. I want to clarify, because it was interesting. Like last episode, last main episode, I sort of acquired a new appreciation for just how well Quaristice stands up on its own. It's funny because for a long time, I felt that Quaristice was lacking something, and once I got into all this extra expanded universe stuff, I felt like I had found it, and I kind of fell in love with Quaristice. And then I was surprised last week to sort of realize that like, and maybe I'm influenced just because now I know all that context and stuff, but like I was just surprised by the fact that like if I just spend like 2 weeks listening to just Quaristice, I am perfectly happy. It actually stands up. It has a nice flow, like, which I don't think I ever fully appreciated before. And yet, so it's really one of my favorite Autechre records, but when you add all of this extra stuff around it, it makes it even better for me. Like it almost makes it like peak Autechre for me. I just love having all of this stuff, and it makes you wonder, like kind of like you were saying, like, so if it I don't know. I guess what I want to ask you is like, do you agree that it is additive? And if so, why did they initially make it like so limited and so hard to actually hear? You know, they clearly wanted the record to act like the main record to actually kind of stand up on its own or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, I think a lot of it has to do with it being 2008, you know, like,
yeah,
they probably could only convince, you know, Warp to make 1,000 of those, especially like with that, you know, it's a really cool like metal case and stuff, you know, like it seems expensive, you know, sort of thing. So I feel like, you know, they know like the internet and file sharing is like big enough that they know the people who want to find it will be able to get their hands on it, you know, which we always were. But, you know, like, I think if it like came out today, you know, like, would you separate them? Would you put it all on one thing? Which now that I'm like saying it, I don't know, and I'm not sure which one works better. But I agree with what you said. Like, I always like. I think, you know, the last time we did Quaristice on the original run of the podcast, we did like all of this in one show, which is crazy. I don't know why we did that, but you know, like, so I've always like kind of felt like Quaristice is like a bit like daunting to even get into because of like versions and quadrange, because I've always like known about those things and had them downloaded and stuff, and so like it takes like an hour long record and turns it into a 4-hour long record that's much more dense and everything. So I think like, spending 2 weeks with it like really showed me as well that like it really does stand up on its own, and now I think I'm looking at like versions and quadrange as, you know, similar as something like Dylan's like bootleg series. You know, it's like, all right, you know, the album's great, but you know, if you're a real head and you wish there were, you know, 10 other copies, you know, of a song or something, like, here you go. And I do sort of enjoy that, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one way to look at it, and I kind of was feeling that way when we started preparing for this episode. But then by now, I feel more like, I don't know, I just love getting lost in this, and that's what I wanted to say. Like the other thing I sort of developed a new appreciation for this week is, you know, reading these quotes that you were reading from Sean about Art of Noise, and then from Rob about Depeche Mode. You know, Sean is very specific that like what they were kind of after is a feeling of feeling lost. You know, like you're kind of supposed to be confused about which one you're hearing. You sort of forget, like, okay, is this the one that does that has that middle section, or is it not? And you're not supposed to have your bearings, actually. You kind of feel like a you know, some kind of like failed Autechre fan if you can't immediately identify like, oh, this is the one from Verges. You know what I mean? But actually, I think you're supposed to feel lost. Yeah. I think that adds to kind of the dreamlike quality of the original album, actually. And my favorite way to listen to this, even though I really do feel like their main record holds up, I'm probably 9 times out of 10 just going to go for the main record. I like throwing all of this stuff on a playlist and just listening on shuffle, because then you genuinely don't know where you are, and you have this like experience like what Sean's describing, which is, you know, it just like, you know, this track, but something sounds a little off, or all of a sudden it sort of, you thought you knew what was next, but then it kind of turns in an unexpected direction. You know, like I know when I'm listening to the versions disc that I'm getting the like sort of alternate versions, you know, but if I'm just listening to like a playlist on shuffle or whatever, and I don't know which one's coming next, you know, like the like Tankakern track starts and you don't know if it's going to last for 3 minutes or like 12 minutes, you know, it could be like anything. And I find that experience really fun. It's like, you know what I mean? Like, just embrace the dauntingness and know that you're never going to quite know where the hell you are.
I think that's my biggest problem, and it's a me problem, and the way I like consume art and stuff. But like, yeah, I mean, I've always, you know, when I like a band and stuff, like I've always been like a completist. You know, I got to hear it all, I got to know it all, you know, sort of thing. And like, yeah, I think that is what always was daunting about this, you know, universe to me, was that like I never could get my bearings, and so, you know, it kind of pushed me away from it. But like, embracing that, I think, like, is the way. I mean, because I've talked about it many times. I don't like playlists. I don't, you know, like I like to put an album on and stuff. So like, you know, I I didn't do it, but I think I should, like, maybe try to get outside the comfort zone and push myself into maybe doing like one of those sort of blind shuffle. I don't even know how to turn shuffle on Spotify. I don't think.
Yeah. By the way, you got to take out Perlin's subrange 636.
Oh yeah, of course.
You don't want to get hit with that hour thing in the middle of your shuffle experience. But even like just the titles, right? You can tell that they're meant to mess with you, right? Like you'll never.
Oh yeah.
They're so disorienting and confusing. I feel like that's really on purpose, and actually, I think that's really fun. So I wanted to get the listeners on the table, and I tried to kind of parse this out. It doesn't work exactly, but these are first listeners kind of commenting mostly on the versions bonus disc, which we'll kind of tackle first. So listener Jackson says, a lot of the versions on here are split into 3 categories. 1, loosely related songs that are just named similarly. 2, what you'd usually call remixes. And 3, extended cuts. There are only a couple of tracks which feel more in whatever category you'd call their live work, where the variance comes from actual improvisation as opposed to remixing. I could see this being confusing to new fans. Yeah, you think? And then I wanted to add this from listener Joe, who kind of was on the same idea. He says, out of all the tracks, there are basically 3 categories. The first is clearly extended versions that the Quaristice tracks seem to be directly edited down from. The second category is tracks that are clearly alternate versions of the ones on Quaristice that you can clearly hear the connection to. A lot of these almost sound like remixes. The third category of tracks is ones that are implied to be versions of tracks on Quaristice due to their naming conventions, and in the case of Autechre, the placing on the album. But the connections are a lot more nebulous. This seems like we really have the difference between a patch and a track coming into play, because I can imagine that these were made with the same setups and parameters, but that they are so heavily messed around with that despite having a shared starting point, the connection would not be clear to anyone who didn't know their process. You want to read the next one, Dan?
Yeah, EBCD says, after finally listening to both releases for the first time, an idea that quickly jumped out to me and keeps me continually intrigued is taking the entire Quaristice saga as one piece, sort of similar to the NTS sessions. That is to say, listening to the original album, versions, and then Quadrange in succession as if it were one album. I think the main reason I'm interested in that idea is because of the sort of narrative structure I envision this series having. Quaristice starts off in a very quirky, fun, lighthearted place, but across all 3 of these releases, the material continually indulges into increasingly darker and more uncomfortable places.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad way to approach it at all either, honestly, because there is sort of it gets, less, carefully edited as you kind of go further on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know that I think that they are supposed to be one record, but I mean, yeah, right. It clearly feels like, I mean, same way with NTS, going into All In is pretty similar to Subrange,
Yeah, I just think that would also give you that feeling, which I've come to feel is kind of important, of feeling a little bit lost, it just accept the daunting overwhelmingness of it. But getting now into the sort of track by track of the versions bonus disc, we kind of put our thoughts out up front there about sort of mixed feelings about how this thing works on its own. The other thing that's interesting that I just wanted to kind of return to is last episode, I kept talking about the fact that when you're listening to Quaristice, you feel like it's a little too fast, it's a little over edited or under jammed. And yeah, the truth is often that actually there wasn't more to hear. They really were moving that fast from idea to idea. When you listen to the versions bonus disc, I guess that's not always strictly true. There are a couple the PLC, ICP. I wonder if that's a Insane Clown Posse reference. I'm just kidding. Or IO or something that really do sound like slightly extended versions or slightly less edited versions of what's on the main album. But it's funny because it's always mildly disappointing. It turns out what they cut out was not staying in the part that you liked most. It's usually they cut out kind of a looser transition from the A part to the B part, or sometimes they cut out just a like a C part even, where it's just like a kind of a long outro of it kind of like falling apart or something. So I think the point stands that it's not like when you listen to Quaristice, you're like, man, I would love to hear them just kind of like jam this. You're not really going to find that here, even though it's longer, which is kind of weird, right?
Yeah, I think that's like what you immediately expect when you like hear about this, but it's not really that much at all.
And I guess like what I found kind of like interesting and revelatory about thinking about that this time is because coming off of the 2022 Dash releases, I've realized, and I guess I could have realized this, listening to any of their live stuff, like the original AE live even, but it's weird that they kind of like jam in reverse. You know what I mean? Like they actually, every time they perform a set, they kind of refine it further, and they actually tend to like kind of tighten it up and shorten it. You think of like a jam band like Grateful Dead or something as like getting looser and looser as each night goes on, but they go backwards. Like they actually get tighter and tighter. And then I think when it gets totally tight, where it's like they know exactly where they want to take it, they stop playing it. They move on to something new. That's kind of like their MO right now in the 2022 Dash. So, it's interesting because what you're either hearing is like, I guess I don't know how to put it, but it's just like, it's not like, oh, they found it and now I get to hear them jamming it more. You're actually usually hearing them like in kind of a looser, rougher, like earlier iteration, whether edited or performed. And I bet a lot of the stuff on the record is like the last time they did it. It's like the most refined, most efficient version.
Yeah, totally. I feel that same way.
All right, so track 1 on the versions disc is called, I always want to call it like Autechre. I don't know. I don't know if it's supposed to.
I think it's a joke on versions, and it's Autechre.
Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, okay, it's got to be that. I'm convinced now. Well, this is the first track. I'm going to get the listeners on the table. Listener Joe said, in terms of the mood, this is basically the polar opposite of Altabiz, which was the opener of the main album, giving the sense of melancholic dread instead of warmly inviting you into a dream. This is one of the least Autechre sounding tracks they've ever released as AE, with the first half almost sounding like soundtrack music from some Stanley Kubrick film, with the last run through the chord progression almost sounding like it could go on Tomorrow's Harvest by Boards of Canada. I like it a lot, and it at first gives the sense that the CD might be some incredible companion album or EP, but then the transition doesn't work nearly as well as the transition from Altabiz to the PLC.
Sunil says, a rare orchestral sound from Autechre makes for a beautiful opener.
And EBCD says, a discordant and haunting distortion of the warm and welcoming tone of Altabiz, like a decaying and zombified version of the track, signaling that wherever this dream is headed is not going to be so fun like it was with the main album. Yeah, it is it doesn't have that like warmth, that like pillowy, kind of like, just warm, welcoming sounds like the listeners are pointing out as Altabiz. And it sort of sets the tone for this record perfectly, which is like Quaristice, but something is off,
Yeah, totally. It's exactly like Altabiz, but something's a little off. I agree. Like with Sunil, it is like kind of strange to hear like kind of just orchestral. Like it almost sounds like untreated,
clean
sort of strings.
Yeah. So we move in then to like the first proper track here, which is the PLC ICP C. Again, in my headcanon, it's a tribute to Insane Clown Posse. Listener Joe said, this to my ear sounds like simply the full version of the PLC from the main album. I don't mind that it was edited down for the main version of Quaristice, but if I ever want to listen to PLC as a standalone track and not as part of the Quaristice journey, then this is the version I want to listen to. Interesting. The section from 3 to 6 minutes is totally incredible and almost reminds me of something from set A or C of the newer live sets. The outro is very recent live setty as well, and I love the chopped vocals in this version. Listening to this version really drives home how acidy PLC is, which is something that doesn't really stand out in the original album version.
Jackson says, the groove this settles into at the end is so sick. Also of note is that the transition from here into Io Mons is buttery smooth, which is interesting because it may or may not imply that Versions is intended to be more than just a compilation of cut content released as a behind-the-scenes kind of thing.
Listener Sunil said, it's interesting to hear what the PLC was edited down from. The edits make a lot of sense when listening to this, and the shorter version feels a lot more polished. The bubbles wear out their welcome a bit. A couple of the transitions feel janky. Despite that, I still love this longer version and prefer it. This is also interesting in that it ties the PLC together with the PLC CCC. That's the one that starts off the Quadrange.ep, which we'll talk about in a minute.
EBCD says we're back in familiar place. The dream sequence is repeating itself, and yet something feels off as the track meanders more in its first half than it originally did. And after a few minutes, we suddenly pivot into new territory we have never heard before. Hearing this extended sort of bridge segment in a track I've been so familiar with in the past felt like opening a door I've been through a million times, only for it to suddenly lead into a drop off or a cliff or something, like I'm peeking behind the curtain to see a new angle of this track that I've never seen before.
Yeah, so of course EBCD and all of their commentary is kind of like imagining like this is one long album, like they sort of mentioned up top, and so there's something kind of fun about it's like it's almost like the album's starting over again, but like I was saying a minute ago, something is off or something is weird or you're seeing it from a different angle. This really is the track that is on the main album, except for it is unedited or less edited, let's call it. And it contains this whole little middle section, which is interesting because, as I think it was Sunil noted, that middle section becomes like the basis for the entire track, the PLC CCC that starts off the Quadrange.ep. I think it's really interesting to sort of, we start to recognize the relationships. But again, I think the point is to not be as insane as me and like listen to this, A-B it like over and over again, but to just feel a little lost. Like, I don't remember it doing this, or, I don't remember this part or whatever. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I love what EBCD like said about like opening a door you've been through before, and it's suddenly being different, that's a good description, I think, of like, this whole experience.
But again, it really reminded me of when you listen to 2022 Dash and you listen to some of the first times they're playing a set, right? It tends to have much longer transitions where it like takes them a while to kind of slowly get to the next piece, and then it's like the next night they do that a little faster because they remember where they got, and then by the last times they're playing a set, it's like surgical how quickly they go. That's exactly what you're kind of hearing here, because that middle section, while very cool and interesting, and I love that it becomes the whole basis for like a whole new track later on in this project, it feels sort of tentative, exploratory, honestly kind of like wears out its welcome a little bit. Like it just kind of meanders for a while, and then they eventually kind of get to the B part of the track. Clearly, when they decided for the main album, they decided we'll just cut this, which is interesting because I don't think I realized like when I was first getting into this project that they were willing to like cut from the middle of tracks. But yeah, they cut out this kind of like exploratory bridge because just like with 2022 Dash nowadays, it's like they're like, I liked where this started and I liked where we got. Let's just skip the like exploratory middle and get there. Of course, the other difference is that it sort of returns to like the opening part at the end here, which is like it's like an extra garbled version, which is kind of interesting. But we can keep moving to track 3, which is called I.O. Mons. A.E. Pages noted, and as I think either you or I mentioned above, this track was one of the few to be released multiple times, appearing also on the Digital Exclusives EP. Listener Joe said, just like PLC, this sounds like the quote-unquote full version that has been edited down. However, the Quaristice version of I.O. doesn't really feel like it's missing as much as is the case with the PLC, as mostly this all just feels kind of extended. If you like I.O. the original, you'll like this, and if it annoyed you in its 3-minute version, watch out.
EBCD says, as with the last track, much of this experience is seemingly going to be spent lingering longer in the same places we've been to before. The dizzying melody of I.O. sticks around long enough to almost get comfortable before it once again pivots into its frantic second half, except we're only like a third of the way through at this point. As it keeps going, any semblance of melody drops out as we are ultimately left with vocals that continue to get mangled beyond recognition. Like anything we could have latched onto from the track's original iteration is gradually being stripped away.
Yeah, so you were, I think, if I remember, not so hot on the original IO. So what do you think about hearing like a maybe twice as long version of it?
Yeah, I like what the listener said, because my first note is least favorite on regular Quaristice, except now it's longer. So that was my note exactly. This one, sort of like the previous one, just sort of feels like the uncut, director's version, or whatever. I think I do prefer the original since it's shorter. But yeah, it's just sort of sort of in that same category as the last one we were just in.
Yeah, but it's funny because this is more like what I thought I wanted. I think what a lot of people think they want when they listen to Quaristice, because it genuinely is just like a longer version of that track. I guess it's disappointing if it's not your favorite track, but I also find I thought I wanted this, but actually it wears out its welcome a little bit, honestly. Like, this is one of those examples where basically what you get to hear is just them kind of knob twiddling longer, like on each section, and especially the ending. It's just like a really long ending where it just gets like more garbled kind of going along, and like you weren't missing a whole lot. I think they actually really successfully like cut it down to the like the actual best part, or like the essence of the track for the main album.
I agree.
We'll keep it moving. Track 4, which is called Philopen. that doesn't seem right at all. The last letters are OPN, so I'm gonna, in my head canon, think of this as a tribute to One Tricks Point Never. I don't know if that even makes sense time wise, but anyway. EBCD said, at a glance, it seems like this is a direct repeat of Plyphon from the original album, a lot easier to say, with no apparent changes until it hits you with a glimpse of an alternate ending. Even the most familiar moments are not safe from changing at a moment's notice.
Sunil says this is like the audio version of one of those spot the differences puzzle. It's almost identical to Python, but with about 10 seconds added to the end. Aside from that, I was only able to notice a few seconds worth of minor tweaks.
And listener Joe said, instead of being an extended version like the first two, this feels far more like an alternate version of Plyphon, the same way that the 800-disc version of Dylan's Bootleg Series 12 has one CD that's all just different takes of Like a Rolling Stone. Maybe they like this one the second best. Did you see Joe's comments, by the way, before you made like the Bootleg Series comparison earlier?
No, I didn't. When I read through this document earlier today, you hadn't added Joe yet, so no, I did not see that.
Yeah. He made others, which I didn't even keep all of them, but yeah, it's funny you're on the same kind of wavelength there. This I think is kind of interesting because it's almost identical, except for like maybe the last 10 seconds, like Sunil says. I can't tell.
Yeah.
And I almost wonder if they didn't throw in a couple red herrings like this, again, just to keep you off balance. Like if you always know that, oh, I'm on the versions disc, so this one will be different. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost good to, even then, you're not sure, like, is this what I heard, or is this like a different version? I was almost thinking like, people are disappointed by the Digital Exclusives EP. It starts with a direct repeat of, I think, I.O. Mons. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that is sort of lame. But I was like, what if it's on purpose? Like, actually, there are supposed to be a couple repeats, or basically functionally repeats thrown in here just to keep you guessing even further.
I mean, reading what Rob had said about like the Depeche Mode thing and everything, I could see that because yeah, I mean, my note on this track was like, I really can't tell what's different. Like it almost just feels like maybe it's a different take. Like the Rolling Stone thing's a good analog to it, but like, yeah, I mean, like, maybe it's a different thing. I was trying to find things. I was like, I think maybe there's a little more reverb, but I don't know. Just sort of grasping at straws of what's different. But yeah, I mean, I think there's some trickster energy in Autechre in general. So definitely.
Well, moving to track 5, which is called Purlance Range 3. Now, from an Ask Autechre Anything, they were asked why there are so many alternative cuts of Purlance and the 90101 tracks. And Rob replied, we did a few more, I guess, and or we were happy with enough to put on there. Sean said, because we had loads of edits of them and thought they were good enough to come out. guess that's what you would expect. Listener Sunil of this one said, I love this Purlance. It's like a middle ground between the lively Purlance range 7, and a more ambient and meditative sub-range and lucid tracks. I see this as a progression beyond Purlance range 7 rather than a reinterpretation, because range 7 seems to lead into range 3, and range 3 seems to lead into sub-range 3. Another sentence that will just make no sense to 99% of human beings.
I was just going to say that. Joe goes, instead of being a full version, this feels much more like a totally different possibility for how Purlance would have started, finished, and developed. More like a recording of their process of figuring out Purlance at an early point than it does a polished alternate version.
And EBCD said, starting in a position totally unlike that of the original Purlance, we're beginning to stray away from tracks that even follow the same structure of their original counterparts. The stumbling and staggered mix of Purlance becomes more and more sparse as it goes on, with its more upfront melodies and harmonies dropping out in favor of subtle pads floating through the mix, while the cluttered and frenzied drums are eventually stripped down to the most bare and simple beat. More bafflingly, we start to hear bits of Chench 9 make their way in. First, vague impressions of its melodies before its booming kick drums also make an appearance, all while the track strays into darker territory before looping back around with the familiar melody we only heard at the start of the original Purlance, as if this entire time we were listening to the original track flipped on its head. Yeah, so this one I think of as being one of those examples of like, this is an earlier iteration, like almost an earlier draft. And I think it really sounds like that in the sense of like, it is just less developed. It is a little bit more like, meandering, a little bit, less clearly defined. I think there are times where like the different parts of the track are kind of just playing on top of each other. Actually, this is one of my like least loved tracks of the whole project, because what I love about Purlance is, when it does that kind of like skipping beat shift sort of thing, it just sounds so like kind of slithery and slippery. And what this version does is it kind of keeps like this steady knocking snare, like kind of going over the whole thing. And so it never like totally lets loose and goes like wildly off balance and everything. It stays kind of like steady and upright, and honestly a little boring to me. Like, so you know what I mean? It's almost like, again, you thought maybe what you would have liked is to hear stuff like this, like a more jammed version, a glimpse at them kind of discovering it. But you find that it's, I don't know, I just don't like it as much. I guess what I really wanted was I wanted them to make Quaristice, and then I wanted to hear them jamming that, but actually we're only hearing before that,
Yeah, no, that's totally how I feel about this one. It feels like an early iteration. I mean, there's a lot more like empty space, that's not being filled, I think. And then, like you said, like those sort of transitions and stuff just don't feel as fully fleshed out. I could see though that like, if you have this on shuffle sort of thing, like the interestingness of that, like sometimes it coming up, being unfinished and fully finished and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, just straight listening to versions, I think this is one of my least favorite versions of a track I like as well.
Yeah, well, luckily we get a hell of a lot more Purlances, which we'll talk about. But we'll move into track 6, which is called Sun DE RE-IX. I feel like this is the hardest one to say, like, of the whole project, as is its counterpart, honestly. EBCD said, whoever called this one of Autechre's most evil tracks is completely right. The stagnant and meandering atmosphere of the original has been twisted into this manic sense of constant tension and building suspension, with the muffled sound of discordant strings evoking a feeling that something terrible is rapidly approaching, but we never quite see it arrive before the track promptly dissolves into silence.
Joe says, all I can think of when I hear this track is the terrifying evil piano from the haunted house level in Super Mario 64. If I found out that they straight up sampled it, I wouldn't be surprised in the least. If this really is made using the same setup as the original, then it's so super modified that I can't really hear it.
Yeah, Joe linked to that that Super Mario 64 level, and I was like, it really does sound uncanny. Like, I was like, they had no business making that as scary as they, like that part of the soundtrack as scary as they made it, actually. So listener Sunil says, this inclusion of this on versions makes me think they took the sequencing seriously, because this does nothing for me on its own, but I think it works well as a lead into Tankraken. Yeah, this seems to be like our stand-in on this versions disc for like that whole first electroacoustic section. Interestingly, like the original is like a minute long, and this one is like 3.5 minutes long. It doesn't sound like really anything like the other one. I mean, what do you think of this?
Yeah, it's kind of cool on its own. I like how like sort of everything sounds kind of far away. It gives it like a strange atmosphere. You know, we talked about like one of the things I liked about Quaristice, you know, coming off of Untilted is like we actually got some space, you know, and some reverb and stuff. And here, you know, is a great example of that. It definitely has like that electroacoustic feel to it. It like that main like noise. It kind of sounds like actually like hitting the piano strings like themselves, you know, rather than the keys and things. It's a cool like atmosphere thing. You know, if it might be more at home on Quadrange, but you know,
yeah, you're right.
If we're sort of half-ass recreating Quaristice, you know, in the track listing here, then I guess it works.
Yeah, I am interested in those kind of like plonking sounds. There's like some noticeable, almost sounds like studio chatter or something in there. It almost like reminds me of Boards of Canada a little bit. Yeah,
I wasn't sure if it's like some sort of sample, like just breaking through, or if it is like, you know, studio chatter or what. Yeah, I noticed that as well.
Well, it sets us up for track 7, which is called Tankraken. Listener Joe said, one of my all-time favorite AE track names, because I just love the idea of a kraken working on his tan all summer. Okay. This really feels like an extended version of Tankraken, and I like how everything has a chance to develop more and breathe.
Sunil says Tankraken is a weird middle ground between Tankraken and... of course, I had to get this one. The one that starts TK. You know, whatever. I hope that sentence wasn't too hard to read. It was.
It absolutely was.
We get a melodic section coming in for a minute. Then it reverts to normal Tankraken again. It's a Tankraken track, so it's great. But anything short of the one that starts with TK feels incomplete. That was a great thing to have to read when my allergies have been killing me, so like it's hard to talk already, and then you give me a tongue twister.
Yeah, this is a challenging one. EBCD said, after the last two tracks, the sound and atmosphere of Tankraken manages to feel welcoming, just as something familiar to grasp onto for a bit. I love this track. I love every single one of these tracks. The weird thing about it, though, and actually I was surprised at how Joe wrote about this time, because I remember, maybe I'm misremembering, but I feel like it was last episode, Joe said, it's almost like, why do these need to exist? Because the 12-minute like supercut on the Quadrange EP is like clearly the best version. And I kind of feel that way. It's like, it's funny because I like the really short version on the main Quaristice album. Obviously, I think it would be nuts to throw the whole 12-minute version on it. Mm-hmm. But I love the 12-minute version on the Quadrange EP, which we'll talk about in a minute. It really, it like justifies being such a big juggernaut. It really makes me feel like it's as good as like an NTS track as far as like that kind of monstrous size. But this one, it's weird because it's like kind of, it's not long and it's not short. So it's like, I don't know if it needs to be here or what.
I mean, again, I felt that exact same way. Like this one seems, you know, sort of superfluous. But, you know, like thinking again about that like off-tilted, you know, Depeche Mode sort of thing, like, mm-hmm. I guess this one is sort of hard to tell immediately, you know, which one you're in. I do like that it kind of has like a more ambient feeling to it than the original. I like the little false ending thing it does at the end. But yeah, this one maybe doesn't need to be here.
Yeah, like in the big picture, I like, as I was mentioning before with like the Plyphon track, like I like a couple of these red herrings where it's like you genuinely can't, like you can't even A-B it and tell which is which, you know, other than the length in this case. So I like that, but as far as this versions disc, it is kind of symptomatic of like the sort of half-assed way this like recreates the original album, you know, like they wanted to put something here and, you know, so I don't know. I'll wait till we get to the big one, which is like one of my favorites. Speaking of stuff that doesn't work that great, in my opinion, we move into track 8, which is called Full 4. Listener Sunil said, a lot more musically coherent than Full 3 from the original album. It actually develops a decent groove. This actually reminds me a lot of Pro Radii. I keep half expecting to hear break.
Joe says this is where people who claim that Versions is a better start to finish album than Quaristice totally lose me. Although Full 3 is far from one of my favorite tracks on Quaristice, it's brief enough. This instead feels like an endurance test of your mental fortitude.
And EBCD said, the once chaotic and overwhelming sound of Full 3 has been reduced to soft whispers and sporadic bursts of noise, certainly a more welcoming and easygoing atmosphere, and yet it just keeps going. Full 3 already felt like it might be overstaying its welcome a bit, but Full 4 feels as if it may as well go on forever relative to the other tracks here. Although the track has taken on a more accessible and gentle tone in its sound, this is to me the first instance that ignores any respect for our time and simply confronts us with indulgent and lengthy immersions in the space they create, like the tracks are losing control and becoming more sprawling and ignorant of our place in this dream. That might sound like a criticism, but at this point I actually think it's pretty cool.
Jackson says, my totally unsubstantiated theory is that there are samples in this track which got reused on M4 Lima.
I could totally hear that. I could totally be convinced about that because these like whooshing, flying around your head tracks. I'm always making M4 Lima comps because I think of it as like the definitive shit flying around your head track that Autechre has ever made. Yeah, I think the listeners are spot on to point out that actually this is kind of less harsh than Full 3, and yet what you gain there, you lose in like just this enormous, utterly momentum-killing runtime. What do you think about this?
Yeah, this one, when you're on your walk and you get to this, it's kind of not that fun for 11 minutes. But I like it that it exists, like because I like experimental music. But I don't think that it's so great on like the record being so long. You know, yeah. I think it would be maybe like work kind of better the way the sub-range that ends Quadrange works. You know, it's an hour, but it's like if you ain't got the time, it's the last track, you can go ahead and skip it, you know, sort of thing. Like I don't know, I think it would be better like that. It just sounds so like wet and slimy, like very like organic. I in my notes like said it reminded me of Alien, and then I realized like we reference things reminding us of Alien a lot on the podcast. But yeah, it's just like sounds are chewed up and spit out, and you know, it's an interesting experiment. I don't know how well it works in the context of an album.
Yeah, we should do, by the way. I wonder if we should do like a bonus episode on the Alien movie. Why not? You know what I mean?
Hey, it's one of my. I'll watch it.
It's totally relevant. We cite it all the time, you know. Anyway, yeah, I will say I listened to this whole project on shuffle a ton, like I was saying earlier, and it is kind of fun when this one comes on. Sunil is right that it actually does kind of like gesture toward a rhythm a little bit more than Full 3, and yeah, I just think it just destroys any momentum that this weird versions disc had going on. But when you're listening to like a 4-hour project on shuffle, it's really fun when you like suddenly fall into this like crazy hole that is Full 4. So I don't hate it in that respect. I just kind of hate it on this record. But we move into track 9, which is 90101-61-01, one of these many 901 tracks. Listener EBCD said, maybe one of the tracks most emblematic of the change in tone and pacing that we're witnessing as this saga continues. Remember, EBCD is kind of imagining, like, what if you listen to the whole thing all the way through? Whereas the original 901 was one of the most fun and energetic, this new form is a stagnant and minimal arrangement driven by its thumping 4-on-the-floor beat. The sound has taken on something hazy with lots of bit crushing and low-pass filtering, like this is what has become of 90101, and we've sunken deeper into the dreamscape, and the world around us is diving into a darker and more unfocused space, even taking a minute or so for the track to actually get going as it meanders in formless space before the drums come in.
Sunil says the shortest of 3 very similar 90101 variations, the other 2 being on quad range. I always really enjoy these.
And Joe says, I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about the 90101 tracks in general, because all of them sound to me so significantly different from the version they put on Quaristice. I hear the same general sound palette, but it sounds almost like they tried a ton of different versions of the same idea and just couldn't get it right until they finally significantly changed things around. I actually like all of the different versions, although some of them sound so similar to me that it makes me wonder why they wanted to focus on the gestation of this particular track compared with others. Yeah, this to me is like the biggest mystery of the project. On the original album, it doesn't really, like Joe's right, it doesn't really sound like this. You know, we get a bunch of 901s, and the most oddball one is the one that ended up on the actual record. I would say the worst one is the one that ended up on the actual record. It's kind of like techno-y, but just, you know, like I kind of joked last time, half seriously, but half not. Like, it's just like, you know, this like squishy acid sounds. Whereas all of the other 901 tracks, almost all of them, are like quite a, you know, lovely kind of acid techno groove with like this actual, like these two interlocking, harmonizing synth melodies. You know, this one is kind of interesting because it's like, I almost think of it as extra techno because it has this 4/4 kick, and on some of the versions of 901, you hear like kind of a kick snare. But this one, the snare is like so subdued, it almost just sounds like kick, you know, and so it really is like full-blown acid techno. I pretty much always really enjoy these. Where are you at on the 901s and this one in particular?
Yeah, I enjoy them. It is like, I think, like yesterday I was listening to both of these, and I was like kind of, you know, writing my notes and everything and getting a little mired down in the like, how do I keep all these straight and stuff, and I realized that like these ones like sort of are like a little bit of an anchor, even though it's like very hard often to like know exactly which one you're listening to off the top of your head, but it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a 901 sort, you know, like I think it kind of was a little bit of a key to the project, having like these couple things that you know, this and the purlances that like repeat and we get different versions of. And here, yeah, this one in particular, I agree pretty much exactly with what you said. Like I wrote the same thing about like that 4 on the floor kick is like so much more prominent, like really like shifts the tone of this one. It makes it much more minimal. I think again this one has like a lot more air to it, which I always feel like when there's more air, it's like an earlier version, you know, because stuff hasn't been added yet. I mean, maybe, you know, things could just as easily be subtracted, I guess, but I don't know. It always felt like that to me.
Yeah, but it could be, but then it's like the one on the record, the actual main record, I have no idea where that might fall because it just doesn't really. Yeah. But it's kind of fun because like when you listen to this track, it starts and you're like, what is this? Like, I don't recognize this. Like, this isn't 901, is it? And then it's funny because when it kind of builds up and it gets this kind of like cool melody going, you're like, oh yeah, that's the 901 melody. And then actually it's not. You're like misremembering because you're remembering from some other 901, not the original 901, which doesn't sound like it, you know? So I actually like that it's not, it throws you off, this project, in a sense where not even the quote unquote original is really the original. You know, it just ends up feeling like one of many different iterations or versions or something. But we move on to track 10, which is called Chench 9X. This is one of those cases where I you know, maybe the X just literally means, you know, expanded or extended or something like that, because it kind of is just Chench 9 expanded. But EBCD says, like with Tankraken, we initially get a moment of respite in some familiar territory, and then the track just keeps going. The foreboding atmosphere that only acted as a bookend to the original Chench 9 persists as the mix gets more hectic, more abstract, and just as bits of Chench 9 manifested in purlants, we now hear fragments of purlants drifting through Chench 9 like the dream is already starting to repeat itself again.
Joe says, an awesome extended version of one of the best tracks on Quaristice. The extended breakdown sections on here really feel like they're jamming or doing almost like jazz solos, and really reminds me of the general vibe of the new live sets.
And Sunil says, I'm pretty mid on the Chench 9 tracks, but it's interesting to hear Perlin's sounds toward the end. Yeah, I kind of think that's the most interesting thing here. It is Chench 9, which I really like from Quaristice, but kind of goes on, like drags on forever, sort of. And I think that is like, I don't know, it's like a curiosity just for a hardcore fan until you hear that it was on the verge of becoming Perlin's. Like you hear those Perlin's sounds. You don't know, I guess, like which of the many Perlinces was happening or about to happen there. But it's interesting because it really reminds me of the process of listening to 2022 Dash. Like, I think it took people a minute to realize, just because of where sets were ending and beginning, like, oh wait, this is one long thing. Like it actually fits. There's a puzzle to complete here, and it's funny because we don't have enough information. We could never do it, but in theory, it feels like you could eventually piece together like what was the Quaristice jam in full. Like what order did it go? Clearly, Chench 9 and Perlin's are kind of connected or close together because, as I think it was EBCD pointed out, like you hear a little Chench 9 in the earlier, like the extended Perlin's here, and now you hear a little Perlin's in this extended Chench 9. I just find that like very tantalizing to imagine, like, what if one day they release, for the, 50th anniversary of Quaristice, like a full recording of one of the day's jams, like how it all might fit together?
Yeah, no, it is like so interesting because like what about those sounds like made it, decide to get split into two tracks at some point, that's something I'd really like to know.
Well, we move into the final track of the versions disc, which is called No 4. Unlike, No 2 from the previous or the main album. Listener Joe said, this feels more like an echo of Autechre than it does an alternate take of No 2. Although the general strings sound kind of similar, it doesn't quite work for me as a closer following the epic journey of Chench 9X. It would work great on some other releases with this as a closer and Autechre as an opener, but with a completely different middle.
EBCD says No 2 already had a vaguely ominous tone to it, but the warm and buzzing pads of the original now seem so welcoming compared to this nightmare of a remix. It seems that as Altabuzz was turned into something so grotesque and eerie, a track already as haunting as No 2 has to indulge even further into the most disturbing territory we've yet heard since the start of this journey. I find there to be something especially foreboding about the way this one ends, like halfway through, leaving us with a lingering reverberation leading into an unwarrantedly long silence before we hear just the faintest hints of some kind of fizzing or scraping noise, as if something is stirring awake in the silence.
And listener Sunil said, I think of this as a progression of No 2-2. It's pretty good on its own, but it sounds the best and makes the most sense when played directly after No 2-2. It's an interesting idea. Yeah, another weird one, right? Because I don't really hear the relationship with No 2. And it sort of sounds like pure strings again. I mean, it's definitely like a little synthier. It's not quite like the opening track, but it feels more like something that is meant to be like kind of a bookend. Again, in like a weird half-assed, or like, I guess, I don't know, if you wanted to be more charitable, like a kind of a doppelganger-y like imitation of the main album, like a Funhouse Mirror version. But I don't know, how does this work for you?
Yeah, I don't see the connection between the two. I mean, it seems like much more a version of Autechre or Altabuzz or whatever than No 2. The end is so weird. Like it's almost like completely silent for a minute, and then there's like some just kind of odd
little
noises.
glitching.
It's like barely audible. I don't know. It's maybe it's just them being funny or something, but it's somewhat strange.
Well, that is the versions disc, and now we're going to move on to the Quadrange EP or Quadrange EPs. We kind of got our high-level thoughts out on the table beforehand, but this is, to me, like, this is what I want. Maybe I didn't even know that this is what I wanted, but this is what I really want, which is like, instead of trying to kind of like imitate the original album with like alternate remixes and versions and stuff, like transform it so radically that you kind of make it into something new, a totally different experience. This record has like a very clear identity. It is much like, subbier, much dubbier. There's like a noisiness to it. It's honestly like the closest Autechre ever came to making like a pansonic record, honestly. Even the way it ends is very pansonic to me. And it is like, like I said earlier, even tracks that are just remixes or like slightly different edits or something, because the context is so different, it just really changes them and makes me hear them in a totally new light. You know what I mean? Like this is like peak. This is kind of what the best case scenario of a project like this can be.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think always, like I said, like when we did this originally, we did it all together. I've listened to Quadrange, on my own, but always sort of like in the context of Quaristice. And like really over the past 2 weeks, like I listened to Quadrange, the most of the two discs, and like, really came to love it. And to bring the bootleg series thing up again, this like sort of reminds me of something like Another Self-Portrait, or where you take like this album that has like lots of different takes and things, and then like kind of making a whole new album out of it, but not trying to like do what Versions did of just like this half-ass A-B kind of thing. Like take the same sessions, make something somewhat new from it. And I also, Quadrange has like such a more of a cohesive mood. Like it feels like an album. If we didn't get Quaristice, we only got Quadrange, I wouldn't be like, something's missing here, like I would be right. I think I would have like the feelings I have about it now, like positive feelings. I think it really like stands up on its own.
And that's what's like so interesting about this, right? Is because clearly the entire impetus was the final track, Perlin Subrange 636, right? In fact, what they're saying strongly implies, I haven't heard enough people discuss this, but like they wanted to put it on the main Quaristice album, but couldn't justify like adding another CD just for that. I mean, can you imagine if like Quaristice ended with that? Like how insane that would be. It's like a bunch of 2-minute tracks and then just like boom, an hour at the end.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like tricky already to be. And I remember, like Quaristice is about the time I started getting into Autechre and paying attention to new releases and stuff. And I remember like seeing that this was an EP that's like almost 3 hours long and being like, that's the kind of assholery I'm into, like really like sold me on the band, I think.
Yeah. And what's interesting, right, as you were kind of noting, it's like clearly that's what makes this work, is every track selected for this, I think, is meant to set the mood for Perlin's Subrange 636. Like that's why everything is much like, it's much spacier, it's much noisier, like slower, heavier, and it kind of trends that direction as we go. Each EP, if you will, is kind of like a step toward Subrange 636. So then it just really hits like, and we get there. And I mean, that's what makes this such a successful project. I wanted to get the listeners on the table up front again with the high level thoughts. Sunil said, Quadrange is the opposite of Quaristice in some ways. Quaristice is about moving from moment to moment without dwelling on anything for too long. And with a few exceptions, Quadrange is about patiently sitting with a groove or a vibe and just letting it go on. It's a very meditative, grayscale sort of experience.
Joe says, whereas Versions seems more or less sequenced as something that feels album-ish, Quadrange has always been a bit baffling to me. It was released as a digital set of 4 EPs, 3 of which are 4 tracks and 25 to 33 minutes each, with the 4th one being one long track that's twice as long as all the other EPs. In retrospect, the whole thing feels very El-Seki, maybe even a bit El-Seki, as you...
I think he was making a joke, El-Sexy with a wink face. face there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't get that. as you were listening to Quadrange this week, did you guys ever listen to it as 4 separate EPs? If so, were you able to discern any identity from each of them, or did it feel a bit like arbitrary data dumps?
Yeah, let's just pause there. What do you think about the idea of treating this like 4 EPs? Does that work for you?
I was trying to think of that, as I was listening and stuff. I mostly just listened to it as one big thing, and I think honestly it kind of works better that way.
Yeah.
The 4 EPs, I fully don't even understand that, because it's not even like these came out, as 4 EPs and then they put them together.
Right.
It was sort of always this way, and I don't know. I find that whole kind of thing a bit baffling as well, I think.
Yeah, it's totally unnecessary, but I think it kind of makes sense, because if you look at it, each EP has like a little arc where there's either the first EP has kind of like an ambient sort of middle section before it then kind of booms back up again. The second one has kind of ambient-ish bookends, between 2 kind of juggernaut tracks. The last one kind of moves from something more rhythmic into something very, very ambient. And then of course the real last EP is the whole hour-long Subrange 636. So there's a little, I think, satisfying arc, and I think an identity between each of them, but it's just because as a whole, this project is like we said, kind of drifting toward or approaching toward Subrange 636.
I wonder, is it just perhaps even boringly a legal distinction? I know, especially back in the early 2000s and stuff, legally speaking, an LP is a certain number of tracks and EPs are different, for their contract. I wonder if Warp didn't want this to count as LP they're owed, so maybe changing it to EPs skirts around that, I don't know. I guess I'm just speculating, but
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's true that there could always be stuff like that, because it does have something to do with contracts and stuff. But clearly they decided to kind of do this again with XI, which they insist, believe it or not, is supposed to be a couple different EPs. Then they literally did it with LSIC, splitting that up again, NTS. So it's something on their mind, and I think it's this is almost the first. Maybe even it was purely practical, but it was something about this, I think, got the gears turning about what you could do with this. And then, so the last sort of high level comment was from Jackson, who said, a lot of tracks in this project, but specifically on Quadrange, featured this one filtered snare sound. It's really crazy once you start paying attention to just how many tracks feature some version of it. From the PLCs to the 901s to the Perlinces, this sound is just the Quaristice sound to me. Yet another quirk to add to the pile for this weird project. Yeah, I'm with you, Jackson. And actually, we talked about this when we talked about the main album, but I think there are a bunch of repeated sounds, and I think that adds to the it's all tied together, all mixed together. That's why I mentioned when we talked about the main album, I like the presence of Full 3, because there's a bunch of weird white noise sort of wiping all over the record, and it ends up working a rug that ties the room together. But let's jump in to track 1, or if you want to think about it this way, it's EP1, track 1, which is called the PLC CCC. Listener Jackson said, the first time I heard this, I was so immediately pulled in. There's an emptiness to Quadrange that's present here and there on Quaristice itself, but which just totally takes over here. An opener like this, along with the stark cover art, sets such a distinct tone from the main LP.
Sunil says, I love this track. I especially love when those wailing ghost sounds come in after the early transition, a bit before the 3-minute mark. Then we just stay in this groove that on paper seems like it should get boring eventually, but never does.
Joe says, this almost sounds like the kind of dub remix that would show up on a 12-inch single version or remix EP of the PLC. There's something about this that sounds very dub to me, with the way the general line repeats in this echoey sounding way. I actually think it's a pretty cool way to start out the whole thing, given that Quadrange is a bit of a chaotic mishmash.
EBCD says the hissing at the end of No 4 works remarkably well as a segue into the glitchy fizzing that overlays this staggered and drowsy beat, accompanied by an array of groaning and whining synths. In its opening moments, the sounds like completely new territory, and then we hear that bridge from the LCPC comeback. The dream is repeating itself all over again, and we're back at the start, but whatever remained of the PLC in its original state has been lost in the murky haze of this new iteration.
So for me, this is one of my favorite tracks on the entire project. I think this is absolutely hypnotic. I'm totally with, I think it was Jackson here, who just like, the first time you hear it, I think it just is a classic. What do you think of it?
Yeah, I love this. I think what the listener said about like, you know, feeling like a dub remix, I feel like a lot of this record is like that. And I love this, like, just like, it's kind of like a down tempo, like very like doom sounding. We get that bouncing ball, you know, sort of noise in it. That is like keeps coming back all through the record and everything. My wife asked if while I was listening to this on the stereo, if someone was playing table tennis.
Yeah.
and then once somebody, you know, points out that it sounds like a bouncing ball, I think it really stands out. But I love like just the big booming bass in there. You know, we get that PLC bridge come in, the tracks shifting. I think this really sets up like what Quadrange, I think, is all about.
Yeah, absolute tone setter. And yeah, it's like there are a lot of sounds like that, like you mentioned, of like, you know, what could be called a bouncing ball, or like it's like snare sounds that have a lot of very dubby delay on them, and it makes like these kind of skittering drum sounds all over this record, which is another thing I love. Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but I just find it absolutely fascinating. This is like it blows up the missing middle section of the original PLC, you know? I mean, like, it's so funny. They didn't like it enough to keep it on the track. We only hear this bridge section on the versions disc, and then they decided, I guess, wait a minute, I actually like that enough that I not only regret cutting it, I want to make an entire 10-minute track out of it. It's like so baffling, but it's just awesome. You know, it's slower, it's heavier. It's like this kind of, you know, heavy knocking. And yeah, I think it was Sunil mentioned these like wailing ghost sounds. It's like these bending low notes that they really remind me of like when you're listening to The Caretaker or something, that kind of like, you know, warping, woozy, like back and forth kind of feeling of like an old record or something. Like, you know, it almost sounds like a track that's like stuck in the like a groove or something, and it just keeps going, you know? I mean, absolutely hypnotic. For me, a classic. We move on to track 2, which is called Purlance Range 7. Listener Sunil said, this is the piece that Purlance was edited down from. As with the PLC, the edits make a lot of sense to me when listening to this. Unlike the PLC, I don't really care for the longer version that much. It's not bad, but it's outshone by the rest of Quadrange.
Joe says this is far more of an extended version of Purlance than the one they actually released on versions. I wonder if the reason they did this was intentional and to not make it so that the versions disc was only versions and make it a bit more difficult for everyone.
Yeah, I think some of the moves are to make it more difficult for everyone, definitely. EBCD says, totally skipping Io and Plyphon, we're jumping right back to the familiar intro of Purlance, although at this point it starts to feel like we're being maliciously teased with the familiar rather than it acting as a comforting respite from the direction these tracks are headed in. That certainly proves to be the case, as this track, initially resembling Purlance in its original state, wanders into the same darker and more sparse territory of Range 3. Yeah, so this is like just the Purlance from the original record, but greatly expanded, or let's say not expanded, but like unedited. What do you think of it?
Yeah, this one at first listen of Quadrange, I feel like you're like, oh, you know, I am just back in versions, you know, like getting basically the track I had, but you know, maybe longer or whatever. But I think this one like really does like change quite a bit in the, you know, the second extended part. Like it gets much darker, you know, which I think works with Quadrange. You know, it brings up that like that sequencing, you know, and then like pieces of those like drums like start kind of dropping out, but you know, like the beats just sort of clinging on. It's like really like blowing up that versions version. Like keeping some recognizable pieces, but I think changing things enough, that makes this like worthwhile and fits into the mood, we're creating here.
Yeah, it fits into the mood because it is like so much dubbier. I mean, right at the end of the original Purlance, you get that like kind of dubby section with those kind of like echoing snares and stuff. But this version, I guess they cut like some long descent into like heavy dub, kind of in between the A part and the B part. Here we kind of like, wallow in that for a while. And then, the outro is like extra extended on that, like really stays in the dubby murk. So it feels totally like of a piece with the PLC. But I think it's a great example of, like I was saying, where this is just such a different context that even the same piece, I'm hearing it in a completely different way. And I just think that's exactly what you want from a project like this. So we move into track 3, which is called Purlance Suns. Interestingly, like another Purlance, but also combined, I guess, with the Parallel Suns kind of ambient track. Listener Sunil says, I always find this really striking and captivating. One of my favorite Quaristice moments.
Joe says, maybe my favorite track on all of the extra Quaristice discs. If I didn't see the name Purlance or Suns, I wouldn't necessarily connect this with either of those two songs, but this is definitely one of my favorite short ambient tracks they've done. I wonder if Parallel Suns started out as an alternate version of Purlance, and this was the bridge from one idea to another.
And EBCD says, things are getting bleaker with each track. The atmosphere that No 4 established is not done just yet, as now we see what the ever-expanding void we're sinking deeper into has turned Purlance into a ghastly shell of itself. Previously, we heard Purlance and Chench 9 beginning to cross over, but now even tracks as seemingly unrelated and incongruent as Purlance and Parallel Suns are being blurred together. So if you listen to this as like, this is just like the next step in some large exploration, we are like getting into the deep, into the murk, right? But another one where, I forget which listener said, but it's like, listener Joe, I don't really hear like a connection to either Purlance or Suns. The fact that they have been combined here makes me wonder again, if you were like trying to piece together the original Quaristice jams, was there some relationship between those two things originally? I guess it reminds me a little bit of like, the original Parallel Suns had that big, like kind of underwater, like cable, whipping kind of a thing, like really big sound, huge reverb space. This is like that, but like the I don't know, like the cable sound is much more like present, and it almost sounds more like plucking a, nylon guitar or something. So maybe there's some relationship there. I guess what I like though is like, there's all this huge reverb in between these plucks. And then there's one point where it kind of like, it's almost like, if you drag your thumb down the whole guitar and hit every string, like the reverb just builds and builds and builds like to an just absolutely insane level. So for me, it's like, I think it's actually quite a cool little piece.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's so cool, like just those notes like seem to like drop into this giant sea of reverb, and then all the notes like they ring out. This what you were saying, like a nylon guitar or something, but I thought it's bell like, it doesn't sound like a bell necessarily, but like, just like that sustain, of a sort of bell thing. I like how some of those note drops like then start to pitch downward, like in the middle of them and everything. I love like the ending drone. I mean, I'm a big ambient head, like in general. So, I love when we get some AE ambient.
Yeah. And I like when it feels like directionful, it actually kind of like goes somewhere, which I think is like a hard thing to pull off in ambient, but I think this is really like a nice proper piece. We move into track 4, or the last track of the first EP, if you want to think of it that way. It's another 901-901-51-6. Listener Jackson said, hell yes, I love when AE do techno.
Sunil said 516 and 5119 are so similar that it's strange they're both on quad range. They don't wear out their welcome for me, though, as I always enjoy them. 516 is quite a bit murkier, and unlike 5119, it includes some of the great bass from 5II.
EBCD says, after the stagnation of the previous track, 90101 busts the door open as if to ask if we missed it, as it gives us another straight 8+ minutes of its continued thumping drums, albeit with just a subtly more chaotic atmosphere than last time. The squelching bass of the original has somehow emerged from the haze, but is now just another part of this new iteration, as if the conversion from the original to this new form is complete.
Joe says, I like this one a lot, but I'm not sure that it needed to be extended out as long as it was.
Yeah, so for me, I got to say this is maybe my favorite of the 901s, maybe. It kind of has like this, more like murky, like distant sound, almost like you're hearing a club from outside, you know? A lot of listeners have made that comparison to various tracks, and, you know, I didn't really get that from the other 901s, so it's kind of interesting to hear it like that. And then I think it just stays very murky and kind of like honestly psychedelic at points. There is a part toward the last like section where you get this like kind of repeating blip that's just kind of like hitting on every beat, and it just makes it like, I don't know, very like spaced out psychedelic, like, you know, like real, you know, atmospheric techno, as opposed to like the acid techno that we've heard this track in that form, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. Because it's definitely like, I mean, it's got that kick snare, you know, techno thing, but there is that like strange murkiness of looking in from like the outside. I like the laser zaps we get. I think this one feels kind of jammy, like, you know, the length of it and stuff, and then the ending, like it just cuts off, you know, like it doesn't come to like a conclusion. It just stops, you know. It kind of feels like we're still not getting the full, you know, picture of it. Yeah.
So that is the last, you know, track of the first EP, if you want to think of it this way. So we move on to the first track of the second EP, which is weirdly another 901. It's called 901 3-2. Listener Joe said, another very cool ambient track that I wouldn't have seen the connection to the other 901 tracks without the name.
Jackson says, after listening to your episode on Pansonic and discovering their music, it has recontextualized a few AE tracks for me, and this is one of them. I think its only connection to the other 901 is the first few seconds of 90101-121.
Listener EBCD says, this dream has fully entered nightmare territory at this point, not just in how unabashedly eerie this track sounds, but also in the sense that we're being told that this is somehow supposed to still be 90101, having seemingly met the same fate that Perlance did in Perlance Sons. Wherever these tracks are headed, it's not going to be pretty. Yeah, it doesn't sound anything like a 901 track. It sounds actually a lot like Perlance Sons in that it's like it's kind of like a very electroacoustic, just like feedback ringing tones, kind of like they actually genuinely start distorting as they kind of layer over top of each other. And then it kind of like similar to the Perlance Sons, it kind of like goes really low down into the murk. This is one of those moments, right, where it's like, okay, it's a little weird, I guess, to follow a 901 with another 901 directly, even though they don't sound anything alike at all. But if you think of that as like, that was the end of one, like you're almost supposed to take a pause or something, like that was the end of EP1, and now this is more like the intro to EP2. It kind of works better, you know?
Yeah, I get that, but the thing is like it's basically never been released that way. You know, it's not like these came out on records, you know, that like built in that pause. Like I just feel like essentially no one ever takes the pause, you know, unless it's like doing something intentional, like making a podcast.
Yeah, because they never even, it's not like, you know, it's not like XI, like this has never been released on vinyl or anything, so it's not, you're never gonna take a pause, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I guess even if you don't take a pause, it like forces you to kind of mentally reset or something, like we're gonna start a new chapter of this or something, so still works for me. But then we move into track, you know, 2 of this second EP, and this is, we already talked a little bit about it, but a hard one to say, Ren. Okay, it's another one of these oil tank sounding tracks, the longest one. Listener Sunil says, the final boss of Tank Acorns. This is easily the best cut in my opinion. The more melodic latter half is fantastic, and it significantly improves what was already a good track. There is much more sense of progression in its full form.
Joe says this really does feel like the fullest version of the three that developed their ideas to the absolute greatest extent and explored the most. I think that it works well, although I think all three versions are edited well enough that they are that they feel satisfying at each of their respective lengths.
And EBCD says, seemingly fulfilling the same purpose of Tang Kraken, acting as a moment of clarity and familiarity in this increasingly bleak journey, even bringing in a pleasant melody accompanied by birdsong in its later moments. It's a very welcome respite from the overwhelming darkness that's otherwise consuming the music at this point. We kind of talked about it already. I don't have a lot to add, but this is another one of my absolute favorite tracks from this entire Quaristice project.
Yeah, I think I like this one the best. I like how droney the tank hit kind of it feels like it gets slowed down at points and stuff. I like the synth sounds like just a little scuzzier and stuff. I don't know. It just Tank Acorn the original. I like. I think it's a highlight of the original Quaristice. But I don't know. This one just sort of tweaks the knobs that make it a little bit more my speed. I like the droniness. I like the scuzziness. I don't know if it's just because I've just spent 2 weeks with it or what, but I think I do like this tank the best of all the tanks.
Yeah, I love it. It's that kind of tank drone or something is just it's pulsing, but then it sort of slows down. It's very cool. The other thing is that one from the versions disc, it sort of goes off into this circus organ type of a very kind of melodic midsection before returning to the main kind of pummeling, sort of tank oil drum droning thing. And this one is just long enough that it kind of does that move twice. It has two sort of circus organ sections. And I as some of the listeners point out, that it gets actually increasingly musical as it is nearing the end. I just feel I could listen, I could listen a full NTS session, 20-minute version of this. I just think this is so damn good.
Yeah, I agree.
We move into the next track, which is track 3 of the second EP, if you're keeping score of that. It's another 901. This one is called 90101-51-19. Listener Jackson said, I love the fake out start. This is one of the few electronic tracks to lean heavily on bit crush for sound design, which I actually like. The degree to which sounds are bit crush seems to rapidly switch around, almost as if the bit crush parameter is partially randomized on each note.
Sunil says, less murky than 51.6, and it pops more. Probably my favorite of the two, but it's close.
EBCD says things are going into total disarray as any track order that was previously present is being totally ignored as 901 comes back once again for even more. We're continuing with the newfound awareness that this stream is not just repeating in its entirety, it's being devoured from the inside out by tracks that refuse to let go of us and will pull us from any moment of respite.
Joe says, why have we gotten so many fairly similar versions of this specific song, while there are other tracks that we didn't get any alternative version of? And side note on that, there are no alternative versions of Sim, Steels, Rail, FWZE, These Were, and WNSN.
Yeah. What do you think about that? It is a shame, WNSN is one of my favorites on the original album. Rail is just such a banger. It's an impossible question, but why so many 901s and Perlinces when there's none of these?
I just wonder if, maybe those ones we don't get alternates of, maybe they just sort of never really were too much different, or, maybe the way they stumbled on it, just wasn't good enough to release. It seems like, especially with the versions disc, kind of going in order and almost trying to A/B it. It feels like it's for a reason. It's like there just wasn't anything worth hearing, perhaps. But again, yeah, it's an impossible question.
Yeah, I think I would return to what I said at the start of this conversation, which is Autechre are kind of weird because they sort of jam in reverse, and when they find the track, they stop doing it because they get bored of it, it's not like the Grateful Dead, who like they start with like this perfect little, lovely track.
They start with the boring one. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they start with like American Beauty. It's the most, refined, perfect version, pop song version of the track. And then it like blows up and up and up, Here it's like they go backwards. And so I think just like we see on 2022 Dash, like if they feel like it's done and there's nothing else to do with it, I think they just stop doing it. So there might even be some of these that they played like one time or something.
Yeah, that's sort of what I always feel. Yeah, I mean, like maybe WNSN or something, was just sort of a one hit, kind of thing. Like got it on, the first take or something,
Well, as for this 901, I'm totally with Jackson here, which is like, I kind of just wrote down like this is the 8-bit version of the 901s. It's a lot less murky than the one we just heard. It's a lot buzzier and glitchier. It really reminds me of like a little bit of the the I guess divisive track from Quaristice being Bouncy Castle. It's got that kind of like Pocket Calculator type of a vibe to it a little bit, and I don't know, that in its own way is fitting for Quadrange because there is like a noisy glitchiness, like that sort of pulsing static that was running over the opening track here, the PLC CCC, that like buzzing and that glitching and that bit crushing is another key thing here. So I don't know. What do you think of like getting another 901 so soon? I feel like it is really quite a distinct like version for me.
Yeah, it's pretty different. I mean, it's definitely the quote unquote bit crushed one. But I like that it's sort of like there's like a robot voice kind of over it, that I think Pocket Calculator is a good, A/B to that. It sounds like sometimes like another vocal sample's coming through. I'm never like fully sure about, getting another one so soon. I think like your initial listen, it's kind of weird, but then you realize you're gonna be getting, you get a lot of 901s and purlins and stuff. So I think it like kind of works like at the end of the day.
Yeah, I don't mind it at all. And actually, it's funny that you said that about like maybe another vocal sample. I wrote down the exact same thing where I was like, it's almost like IO a little bit, where it's like you almost feel like some of the like garbled sounds, like kind of bit crush sounds, like it sounds like a voice, like maybe you're kind of like thinking, but it is interesting actually that on the 901 that is on the versions disc, there is like kind of it starts with like what sounds maybe like somebody counting like really kind of deep in the mix or something like that. So I think there are some human speech or something like layered into this, kind of like IO. All right, we move into Purlin Subrange 3, which is the last track of the second EP, if that matters to you. Listener Sunil said, this seems to pick up where Purlin's Range 3 left off. Really nice meditative ambience.
Joe says a very cool kind of intimidating take of Purlin's, which it sounds like 636 is a significantly slowed down version of.
Listener Jackson says, I love how bassy that kick is. Reminds me vibe-wise of being in that huge abandoned facility in Portal 2.
EBCD says, at this point, it's evident that 90101 and Purlins are like the main antagonists of this whole saga. While 90101 has remained largely stagnant and unchanging in its iterations, Purlins has returned with a vengeance in a form far more devastating than we've previously heard it. The track immediately begins in a much darker place than any previous iteration, and it only goes deeper as the track's atmosphere gets even darker and more desolate as it continues.
Yeah, so this one, I think this is the first time you really can directly hear Subrange 636 on its way. It is very, there's like this kind of reverb, layer hanging over the whole thing, really droney. And it's kind of, it's similar to like the first track on Quadrange in that it's like kind of just taking the mid part of that previous Purlins that was on the versions disc, Range 3. I'm confusing myself now. It literally is like the sub Range 3. It takes the Range 3 and it's like we're just underneath it, like in this really reverby like cavern or something, and you can just kind of hear like this, subby thumping thing. So very, very quadrange, very steady knock. It's funny because like actually on listening to that Purlance, the range 3, the one thing I don't like about that one is that it is so steady, when I kind of like the fact that Purlance is so like slippery and slithery. But this is like leaning into the steady knock of it all. And it kind of makes like a very new, different experience out of that. But yeah, you can just tell that it's almost like if we kept listening to this for several hours, it would become sub-range 636,
Yeah, I love this one. I mean, again, this is just like, peak ambient AE. I love that like huge bass that we get on this. It's just so dark that it's like that atmosphere of Quadrange is just building up. It's getting droney. I love it. This is probably one of my favorites on this record.
Well, we move into the next track, which would be the first track of the third EP. It is Chench 9 1 Dub. Listener EBCD says, since Chench 9 has evidently been Purlance in disguise this entire time, I don't see why it wouldn't tease us with another brief callback to where we used to be in this story before we reach the conclusion of this descent into the abyss.
Joe says, does indeed sound like a dub version of Chench 9.
And Sunil said, I could have done without this, to be honest. It's not bad. I just don't love the Chench 9 tracks. What do you think about this one?
Yeah, this one, I really, like, I laughed at Joe's thing, but I mean, he's right. It really does kind of, it's like the normal Chench 9, like, melody, but this time, we've got, like, a huge dub bass kick. I feel like the drums are maybe going, like, a little more fast and everything. But then I feel about halfway through, it like switches, and we get these like kind of glitchy notes raining down like in the back of the mix. It really reminded me of, like in the Matrix, like whenever they show a computer and it's like the numbers coming down, like it just feels like that, like just glitchy, whatever digital, something happening in the background.
Yeah, I really enjoy this one because, it's that main, harpsichord-like kind of chiming melody from Chench 9. But, like you said, it's like almost really chaotically fast kind of percussion. It reminds me of like when Aphex is going like full acid freak out. But the kick is like really sparing and tentative. So it has this kind of weird, like, it's so fast, it's slow kind of a feeling, which I really enjoy. Especially as we are, if you think of this as like kind of, again, whether you agree with it or not, the first track of the third EP, I mean, it's meant to kind of like, I think really shift us further into the direction of like, ambient drone territory. So it's kind of cool that it's like, it's fast, but coming down at the same time. It's also interesting actually that it seems to be in like 6/8 time, and the kick is like on the 1 and the 4. It's just like really, it's like stuck, but also moving really fast at the same time. I just really think that's cool. The next track, which is the second track of the third EP, it's another, you guessed it, 901. This one is called 90171-121. I don't want to read into it too much, but it's weird that there's no dash. There's only one dash here. There's usually 2 dashes. I don't know what to make of that. Listener Jackson says, this is my favorite Quaristice universe track. The sinister melody in the background of the techno 901s is brought to the forefront of attention here, and it's expressed in so many different ways through so many different sounds across the course of the track. This thing feels alive to a degree that I didn't know Autechre had the ability to invoke prior to the original AE Live.
Sunil says, another great entry in the 90101 series, and a bit of brightness in what is an otherwise pretty gray and murky record.
Joe says, probably my favorite of all the 901 tracks.
EBCD says, finally breaking from its stagnation, 90101 returns one last time in by far its most disorganized and erratic form yet, and I swear to God, they also brought in bits of Purlance for this one too, if you listen closely enough. 90101 had pretty much redefined itself entirely at this point, and now even its new form has been torn apart and mangled into something completely unrecognizable.
Yes, I also think this is a fantastic track. One of the best 901s for sure. It is really interesting because 901 I kind of think of as like an acid techno track. This one sort of like shifts it into, almost like hip hop beat territory. It really sounds like a straight up like IDM track, if that word means anything. Like, this sounds like IDM rather than techno all of a sudden. And it's just cool that it's like, yeah, it's like the same track, the same language, but you just like kind of tilt it on its side and it becomes really radically different, I think.
Yeah, I had this one marked as being, I think, the coolest of the 90101s. I think this is my favorite. I like how, like, at the start, it's a drone, and you think, like, kind of even at this point in Quadrange, like, okay, yeah, that's what we're headed towards. Maybe that's all we're gonna get, and then, like, bam, it just like explodes into what the whole track. I love also this one. There's like a sample mixed in. It gets like kind of chewed up, and sometimes it's recognizable. It's like a comm loop of some sort of talking to astronauts.
Oh, yeah, right.
And we're in the midst of the Artemis 2 moon mission right now.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a big space head, and I just leave it on the TV all the time, when we're not actually watching something. And so I had to keep checking. I was like, oh, did I forget to mute the TV? Is it bleeding in? I couldn't tell if it was real or the song or whatnot. So, that was pretty fun.
Another cool thing about this one is pay attention to like the very end, like as it's fading out, you can hear that it kind of like, it goes like a little start stop. That's kind of why you can hear like the astronauts talking like in between the like pauses. Mm-hmm. And it all of a sudden like assembles itself into what could have been, I think, like an absolute banger new track on its own. It's just like really, really cool. Like the fade out is like a new idea. I guess it just goes to like show that in theory they could have kept iterating, on it. There could have been even more. But we move into track 3 of this third EP. It is called Perlance Lucid 2. That could be a capital I don't know. Listener Sunil says, another leg of the epic Perlance journey. It feels right that it falls between subrange 3 and subrange 636. It's less relaxed than the subranges, but still very meditative.
EBCD says, continuing where subrange 3 left off, it seems like Perlance is reaching its natural conclusion, as if the expanding and all-encompassing space developed in its last iteration has now consumed the track entirely. The drums are barely present, as if we're hearing the ghostly echoes of whatever rhythm used to be there. Meanwhile, anything resembling a melody has been engulfed in so much reverb that it's all become a blur of droning harmonies drifting around the mid-range of the track, with pretty much nothing in the upper frequency bands. Looking back at the original Perlance at this point feels like staring at Earth as a minuscule speck from somewhere ludicrously far away in deep space, like on the way to the moon. We've reached the event horizon at this point, and whatever we used to be has been far beyond our reach for a long time now.
Joe says, sounds like they were having a lot of fun messing with the Perlance possibilities. Definitely sounds cool. Yeah, this one's really interesting. It's like you can't even... It might be just like a super like micro fragments of Perlance or something, because it just has this kind of like glitchy, chopped, kind of like sputtering feel. It really reminds me of The Field, who we did a bonus episode on, and his use of like really small, micro fragment samples or something. It almost feels like, yeah, Perlance has been chopped up and is just like sputtering, glittering in this, just kind of wash of reverb. I think it's really awesome.
Yeah, I had it as like the notes like just sort of pop into existence. Like, they're never like fully, there. It's pretty cool. I like too the drums, like they start feeling like they're just barely holding on. It doesn't feel like they're gonna last. Like everything is just getting swallowed up by that drone. The listener that said like, the event horizon, like it really does feel like that. Just really barely hanging on there.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, because the drums are now officially gone, because we move into track 4 of the third EP, which is No 2-2. Listener Sunil said, this is another case, as with TK. This is the hardest one to say, the TK one.
The Quadrange one.
Yeah, the Quadrange tank track, where the extended version significantly improves an already good track. The extra material here is great and adds a lot.
Joe says a really beautiful extended version of No 2 that would have worked well as a closer on Quaristice if they also hadn't had Alt 9X.
EBCD says, this might be one of the most chilling and disturbing tracks to have ever come from Autechre. No 2 in the context of Quaristice was already a pretty outstandingly dark and eerie moment, but hearing it in its original form after all we've gone through makes it feel like a welcome return to the original Quaristice, and we're generously allowed to pretty much hear it out in its entirety, except that's only the first half of the track. The second half of this track feels like seeing the curtain get pulled back, like realizing that being drawn to the familiarity of No 2 has only lured us deeper into the abyss, past the event horizon and into the deepest reaches of this nightmare, into a place that nothing will escape from.
Jackson says the second half of this one is strikingly similar to the ending music on Super Hexagon of all games, which I've always found to be a bizarrely intense and beautiful for such a simple mobile arcade game. I don't know that game. Also, love the sound that comes in at 8:10 and continues to distort for a while. That sound invokes actual fear.
Yeah, an interesting one because it's another case of like we literally heard the first 5 minutes of this as on the original album, and it's like we just get to keep going longer, and what's after that is like something a little bit, I don't know, chilling. It's like kind of these just, you know, dissonant strings. There's a lot of like hiss, almost like tape hiss on these sounds, and it really reminds me of like Gavin Bryar's Raising the Titanic or something like that, like the kind of
Singing of the Titanic.
Oh, Singing of the Titanic, like the hiss. Yeah, I'm thinking of the Aphex remix. The hiss that's over the whole thing. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this works great at this point in Quadrange. I mean, again, I think this is why this like EP as a whole like just works well. It works like an actual, you know, record. We're just like completely lost in space at this point. These huge drones, huge held notes, big deep bass notes, which I think that the like big huge, you know, bass kicks are, you know, the through blood of this record, and here, you know, like, you know, we're just descending even more into them, and I'm totally here for it.
Well, they're going to continue into the next track, which is the last track of this project, and also, you know, the only track of the fourth EP, if you want to look at it that way. Perlin's Subrange 636. Some notes from AE Pages, who said, the longest track Autechre has released, sitting at 58 minutes 36 seconds, all in from the NTS sessions, only goes up to 58 minutes 22 seconds on digital versions. How lame. Couldn't even make it that extra couple seconds. This track was done by Sean with some of his parts slowed down. Listener EBCD had this to say, this is the end of the line, the only place this journey could have reasonably led us to, with the trajectory it had started taking forever ago. This sounds like the eternal void of the universe translated into sound, like after being drawn to the deepest reaches of this abyss, we're now stuck drifting through an endless darkness in total isolation from anything resembling home. Having this track be so ridiculously long compared to anything that has come beforehand really enforces that feeling of eternity. Even if it's only an hour long, it may as well go on forever.
Sunil says the deepest level of Perlance, its greatest background music.
Jackson says tracks like this or All End fall into the radically lengthy ambient monolith family in my mind. What I like about tracks like this is their ability to put me in a hypnotic spell. All End is incredibly good at that and has a very peculiar effect on me when I listen to it. This track, though, just doesn't do that to me. As such, I'm rarely compelled to revisit it, even though I don't dislike the loop itself.
Joe says, I'm sorry, but I'm a hater. I really can't hear this as anything other than a slowed down, trollish version of Perlin's Subrange 3, and I was really excited how All End was going to end the discussion about this being the longest track of theirs, except that it is still annoyingly a tiny bit longer. I love the long ambient pieces, but this ain't it.
Yeah, so I guess my take on this is I weirdly do enjoy listening to All End. Like there have been many times in my life where I just listen to it all the way through. I think it like, NTS like kind of arrives there like naturally and organically, and I just like I'm there, This I usually don't listen to all the way through, but I kind of feel like you don't need to. I really think of it the way I think of like, the last track on the first Neutral Milk Hotel record. What's it called?
Pre-Sister Swallowing a Donkey's Eye.
There you go. So that is like basically this huge, I mean, it's honestly comically small compared to this like 12 minutes long.
Yeah,
but it's just like this huge like sound, sort of wall, like clanging, pulsing sounds. And it's just cool because like the end of the record sort of explodes and climaxes into like this huge wall of sound. And then you just kind of hear it like peter out over the course of 12 minutes. And when I listen to that record, I just feel like stick around as long as you want, and then you can go whenever. You know what I mean? It's almost like, like the credit music or something, like leave whenever, and I kind of think of Subrange 636 as that. And I think it works awesomely that way. Like I almost never go all the way through, but I love how the whole record has led up to it. And I find myself often, getting like about halfway through or something. And then I'm ready to leave,
Yeah, I think the analog of Pre-Sisters is a good one. Because like on the vinyl of that, it is much shorter. I think it's only like 3 minutes long or something. And here, I think I agree with you. I love long ambient tracks and stuff. I love taking like an idea and then like distilling it down to like the barest, essence, which I think this is what this is. It's like taking the essence of Purlance and sitting with it for an hour, and I love that kind of stuff. But you're right. Like here, it really is like sort of exit music, exit when you feel like. I love to put it on, like with reading, and like even this is the one thing from Quadrange that I do honestly go back to and stuff. I even said during our Quaristice episode, it was the one thing I put on because I there's like a handful of like these big ambient things I like to put on like when I go to sleep, when I read and stuff, and like this is in that mix of it, with like Nyblock and Basinski, bunch of stuff, but like all these kind of things are just like taking this like the essence of something, like taking something like so quote unquote like boring as like just one loop, and like you get in this hypnotic thing. I like it, but I agree, it's not like something you don't have to sit here for 58 minutes if you don't have 58 minutes. You can have 2 minutes of it, you can have 30 seconds of it, really. The same way like Pre-Sisters, the song right before it, I think it's April 8th, like ends on that. The last note of that song is actually in Pre-Sisters, and so it's like you got to start it, but you don't have to finish it.
Yeah, and just like its existence, it kind of like looms over the whole record, and you feel like it feels like the black star that all of this is kind of like getting sucked into or something. And so even if you never listen to it all the way through, it adds just like a really cool energy to this record, and a really cool like centerpiece, central gravity, if you will, like to this record that everything else kind of like revolves around. And so I don't know, I just think like, I don't know, the people who like Joe or something, it's like, if you don't get it, like just listen to a little bit of it, you know what I mean? It's like you don't I don't think you have to listen to the whole thing.
No, totally. I mean, I honestly, On Avery Island's one of my favorite records, and I very frequently do not listen to much more than 30 so odd seconds or however long it takes me to switch Pre-Sisters off.
Yeah, and so like it's an interesting track kind of because I don't know, is my mind just playing tricks on me? But I feel like it's not just looping. Like it feels like there are a couple different sounds. There's like this kind of low bass, like almost like buzzy tuba type of a sound. There is a kind of a knocking sound that's like close to you, and then actually kind of a knocking sound that's really far away to you, like really reverb drenched. There's like these kind of plucks. They're a little bit melodic in nature and just kind of like echoing out. And then of course, just a wall of reverb. And I almost feel like I don't know if it's like just the time is changing, but it just feels like sometimes there's like a lot of distance between sounds. Sometimes there's a little bit less. I feel like it kind of starts and ends like moving a little bit faster than in the middle. It's like a little bit more spacious, and the whole time there's just all this reverb in the empty space. But it at least creates the illusion of constantly evolving, like very slightly, which is what I like from big pieces like this.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about it several times on this podcast, but like, yeah, that's what I like about like these minimal and ambient kind of things is like that trick of, is it actually changing or not? The one kind of thing that bothers me a little bit of this is like that one like bass hit that happens, it like kind of clips, and it just always like makes me think either my headphones or my speakers are like kind of messed up, and I just wish that clip was shaved down, but it works.
The other thing I wanted to ask you is where the hell is Autechre? Like the closing track of Quaristice. Everybody thinks it's weird because it's like No 2 is already a closing track, and then you get like this second closing track, which I know people like a lot, but there's no other version of that. Mm-hmm. Then we get to this record, and it's like, the No 2 is kind of like it's like the false ending or something, and then we get this like Purlance. But it's just funny, like you would almost think like the natural instinct is to do like an expanded version of Autechre, let that drag on forever. Isn't its absence from anything else like kind of strange?
I know it is. Autechre works in mysterious ways.
It's true. Well, we have made it through both albums, if you want to call them that, both releases. Any change in your overall impressions now that we've kind of broken it down, gone step by step?
No, I think just in general, like I think I really am appreciating Quadrange a lot more than I ever really did in the past. I think my enjoyment of versions is about the same as it was before. But I do, like I said at the beginning, I think I do need to try to listen in a way that bothers me, of like the shuffle and everything. Because I really do think there is some merit to that. It honestly sounds like a kind of fun experiment.
Yeah, I really recommend lean into the getting lost in this thing. And what's interesting, right, is like, I guess like I said before, I mean, the Quaristice album, you can listen to it alone. It's great. Or you can listen to it as part of this whole huge era, which is awesome. The Quadrange EP, you can listen to it alone, or you can listen to it as part of this whole era. The Versions disc, you can only really listen to it as part of this whole era. I don't think I'm ever going to be listening to it alone, but it's awesome as that. So a couple other high-level thoughts just to wrap us up here. EBCD said, I think this interpretation I made up actually made these releases a lot more captivating to me, as it turned them from what I would otherwise take as a data dump of random alternate takes and extended cuts into a narrative that starts in a chaotic but fun place, gradually shifting focus toward an all-consuming darkness and desolation, which I find really amusing. I originally thought the abundance of 901 and Purlance remixes were pretty excessive, and part of the reason I had never really gotten into these records, but now I think it's really amusing to hear how each iteration of these tracks shows some sort of evolution or step in a new direction, especially with Purlance as it continually strays further from where the track started. It is true, actually, that if you listen to the, like all the 901s or all the Purlances or something, they do get like more and more abstract, right? Like as you go along. So there is something of an arc here, which, yeah, I think I'm actually, I've never done it, but now I'm sort of curious to like, I'm going to listen to the whole thing in order and maybe hear what that sounds like.
The other thing, like what he said, like, all these Purlances and everything, like, and 901s, I think like if you don't know and you just look at the track list, because you see that, I think you assume they're all gonna like sort of just be remixes of each other that sound very similar or something. And I think that like can kind of like the just reading the track list can maybe turn you off, like I personally I hate remix records. It's just sort of boring and stuff. So like I think that has always kind of kept me at an arm's length, I think, before I really like the first time on the podcast, like listen to this record and realize that like a 901 doesn't really mean 901 all the time, or Purlance the same way.
Yeah, that is a good point, actually. I bet that has kept a lot of people off. And the other thing that's been hanging over this whole conversation is like, it is really interesting that I think the entire reputation of Quaristice, I think, is going to change now that these releases are on streaming. I bet a ton of people are hearing them for the first time, and I bet it's just going to radically shift how people think about Quaristice overall. And my gut is telling me it's going to like probably make people like Quaristice a lot more.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. You know, I think people are gonna like see the idea behind it and stuff. Trending upwards.
Yeah. Listener Joe said, what's fascinating to me is that all of the tracks on Versions and Quadrange are named in a way that imply they are alternate versions of tracks that were released on Quaristice. There's no outright outtakes. This makes me wonder, did they really put all of their main ideas that they felt were good enough to release on Quaristice, and what they had left over were various versions of those ideas, or did they specifically want to focus on how many permutations of their different ideas that they had in an early version of what they would later do with their live sets? My gut is telling me that we've heard everything. Like, I don't think there are like songs, you know, or compositions that they never released. Like, I'm willing to bet really that there is like a Quaristice type set that they were like kind of in a proto 2022 way, like adding to it and just recording these jams every day. And you know, my feeling is like that there's not, I mean, part of the fun of this project is that like it almost creates the illusion of like it could go on forever, or you know, there must be like a million versions of everything. But I bet actually that we have heard almost everything there is to hear. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get you. I think like too, like a lot of the naming conventions I think are trying to lead you down that path. I mean, just anytime you name things like numbers, it kind of implies like, you know, if this is 901, you know, where's the other, you know, 900 of them, you know, or whatever. But yeah, I agree. I mean, sure, maybe there's like some abandoned tracks or something, but I think you're hearing, you know, everything that was like at least worth sweeping off of the cutting room floor.
Well, we did it. I was worried this was going to take hours and hours, but I mean,
me too.
It's still long. I don't know if anybody is is going to make it all the way through on these, like, you know, obscure bonus discs of this not that loved Autechre release, but some people will. And we made it through. Should we wrap up with some new music recommendations?
Let's do it. All right. Well, like I said, about the only thing I like as much as music is space. And so with Artemis 2 and the Return to the Moon, I'm going to recommend Brian Eno's 1983 record called Apollo, Atmospheres and Soundtracks. It later served for soundtrack for the documentary For All Mankind about the Apollo project. But this is a great ambient record of his. Features Daniel Lanois, you know, later of saving Bob Dylan's career fame. So I appreciate that. This is just like such a great, this is honestly, I was mentioning like some of those things I go to bed with. This is one that's long been in there. It's just like a great spacey ambient record. I mean, you know, the cover's a close shot of the moon. It feels like that. Lanois doing like some really cool like guitar things that I don't think you hear on you know, Eno records all that much. At least not played by Brian Fripp or Robert Fripp rather. So it's really interesting, and it's a record of his I don't see get enough love, so I'm going to recommend it this week. 83's Apollo, Atmospheres and Soundtracks.
Nice. I honestly, there's like so much good music coming out all of a sudden that I'm like drowning in stuff that I want to recommend. I meant to text you actually. But there's you know, that Venetian Snares record that you and I are both like very fond of, traditional synthesizer music.
Oh yeah, I meant to text you about it too, because it got a 10th anniversary or something.
And speaking of, you know, Quaristice style, I mean, it's almost like been doubled in length with like extra tracks and stuff, which is
I haven't gotten around to it because I've been so up this moon mission's ass. But yeah, I saw that and I meant to text you. Yeah.
Well, anyway, the record I decided to actually recommend this week, it makes me a bit of a normie because everybody's talking about it, but this new Underscores record, it's called You. Last week I went like pure pop with the Robin recommendation, and this is more pure pop. It's kind of like
we're losing Patreons.
Oh yeah, maybe. No, I'm a huge fan of 100 gecs, and it feels like every year a new band comes out that's basically copying 100 gecs, and I always like it. This is a little different because it's kind of like, you know, you can tell it's born from the Gex style, but it's not so bonkers and crazy. It's actually like it's almost like people who are incredibly sophisticated songwriters. I mean, this is quite like progressive pop song construction in these tracks, kind of using the sound and style of that kind of hyper pop thing. And I don't know, the songwriting is just like really stunning. Like the way it changes, like every track changes quite a lot, like crescendos in really interesting ways. So underscores you, if you're in like a really, sugar rush kind of hyper pop mood, definitely check this out.
All right. I hate hyperpop, so I will not be doing that. But next time, our bonus episode is going to be on Monoliths and Dimensions from Sun. So join us. Head over to patreon.com/GONKCAST. After that, a main episode on Autechre's best closing tracks. So share your thoughts via Patreon, or you can email us, gonkcastpod@gmail.com. If you like the show, help us out. Tell a friend, leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Follow us social media. All that's at GONKCASTPod. And we'll see you next time.
See ya.